It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Judith Rosenstein from the United States Naval Academy, and a few words of introduction right now. So Dr. Judith Rosenstein is a professor of sociology in the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law, and senior prevention consultant for the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office, SAPRO, at the United States Naval Academy. She holds a PhD degree in sociology from Naval University. Professor Rosenstein's research interests include sexual assault and harassment, inequality, race and ethnicity, gender violence, sexuality, bias-motivated violence, and gender and the military. Her research examines gender bias in professional organizations, sexual violence and harassment, particularly in military settings, female and male rape acceptance, and leader development. Dr. Rosenstein's expertise in the fields of gender and sexual violence is a key resource for the Naval Academy due to its direct relevance to young officers' roles in leading gender diverse teams. Her scholarship has directly impacted the United States Naval Academy's sexual assault and harassment prevention curriculum and the Academy's peer evaluation system. Her research exploring how military women process experiences of gender highlights the cultural and climate challenges and will offer insight into how to reduce those behaviors that contribute to a climate and culture of disrespect. Professor Rosenstein has published extensively in numerous high-ranking journals and edited collections. Her work appeared, among others, in Sex Roles, Military Psychology, or Violence Against Women. We are truly honored to have Professor Rosenstein as our speaker in the Language of the Power series this year. And today, Professor Rosenstein will talk on sticks and stones, the power of language. Please join me in welcoming Professor Judith Rosenstein.
Thank you so much, Dr. Palachuk, for those kind words and for inviting me to participate in the seminar. And I'm truly honored to be the inaugural speaker for this year's seminar. Before I get into my talk, just sort of a little bit of housekeeping. I want to provide a disclaimer that what I say here is representing me only. I am not representing or purporting to represent the Naval Academy, the Department of the Navy, or the Department of Defense. Also, while I have tried to avoid the use of jargon or particular terminology, if I do use something, hopefully I won't, but if I do inadvertently use something, please ask. Over the past few years, I've been thinking more about language and the power of words. Growing up, when children would say something mean to another child, call that child names, we would often say, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names can never hurt me." While the message of this response is that name-calling and cruel words are unimportant, we know better. Children know better. We know words can hurt. We know words have power. And we know they can cause psychological harm. While we can talk about the importance of language, the impact of language in a variety of contexts, I'm going to focus on gender in professional contexts. That being said, we could talk about pretty much have the same conversation focused on other categories such as race and ethnicity, ethnic origin, religion, sexuality, pretty much you name it. We can loosely categorize language within the workplace as either interpersonal or organizational. This is obviously a gross oversimplification, but for the sake of today's conversation, I think it's a useful starting point. Interpersonally, words can be used in formal and informal interactions. They could be casual conversations. They could be meetings. They can be the opportunity for empowerment, what's been termed sponsorship. They can also be used for negative behavior, such as harassment. Organizational and institutional contexts include things like documents and artifacts, speeches by leaders, mission statements. They can be inclusive or exclusive, terms that explicitly include or exclude language that is inclusive, that we could talk about words that we intend something to be inclusive, but actually isn't. And this applies at all organizational levels, throughout the organization. The choice of an application of words can create a welcoming environment or a toxic one. Can be the difference between getting a job or promotion and being fired or not passed over in favor of someone else. Believing that one belongs or that one doesn't. So let's start with the interpersonal domain. And within that, I want to focus on the language of exclusion. Often, we think of language, or we could talk about language specifically, we could talk about harassment, for example, as targeting a particular individual. And the messages of that communication are then presumably directed at the individual target, with the messages of, you don't belong, you're not one of us, you're not worthy, for just a few. But they're equally applied to the target's group. It's not just the specific person to whom that message is being communicated. It is everyone of the group to which they belong. In contrast, or at the same time, not really in contrast, the messages might be being communicated to the speaker's group. In some language, that might be the perpetrator. If they are saying something, if they are being exclusionary, if they are being harassing, they may be communicating to their own group. I'm one of you. We're better than them, inherently creating inclusion, exclusion, creating difference. So then, where do we go with that? How do we understand that and its implications? Well, we see the messages here overtly and covertly. I'm going to give a few examples of how language is used to communicate exclusion. So I'm going to read these. This first one is from a student at the United States Air Force Academy preparing to be an officer in the Air Force. And in a set of interviews, he said, it's just that I have to choose between sending in, 200 pounds jack dude as opposed to this girl who's just as capable. I would rather send in the guy to run in the door first, to, get shot at and say, okay, you're going to absorb all the bullets after you get shot. We're going to come in. It's just human nature. So what's he saying there? He's saying, even if I have an equally capable woman, I'm going to pick the man. Does he say this is because I like women, or I want to protect women? I don't like women. I feel more confident and comfortable with a man. No, he says it's human nature. So he doesn't even acknowledge his own role in this. He just says this is a blanket statement that it is human nature, and obviously implied it makes sense to want the man. The next example is from a study of workplace harassment in STEM fields. It is from the sexual harassment of women, climate, culture, and consequences in academic sciences, engineering, and medicine. And the woman is a speaker who had experienced sexual harassment. She describes that it's more than the stereotypical sexual advances that we think of. She said, most of them are demeaning the woman, shutting her up in the workplace, demeaning her in front of other colleagues, telling her that she's not as capable as others, or telling others she's not as sincere as you people are. I think more stress should be on that. It's not just, touching or making sexual advances, but it's more of at the intellectual level. They try to mentally play these mind games, basically, so that you won't be able to perform physically. She's describing this experience of being told she doesn't belong. She's not good enough. She's not welcome. And in this case, it's a message to all women in that position. The final quote, or to use proper terminology in this case, extract, is from work that Dr. Pawlicek and I have been doing. And for those of you who are interested, it's actually a sneak peek to a talk that we are giving on Thursday, and she can provide you details. So this is a woman at the Naval Academy, and in response to the question, what would be those moments? What would happen specifically that makes you think that, well, this is still a very masculine space? She's a, what at the Naval Academy we call plebes. She's a first-year student, so young, although she's just completed her first year. She says, I guess mostly it's in like things people will say in connotations. Like, I guess like even this morning, our training officer was walking around and he looked at our shoes and inspected us and looked up and said, well, Miss Smith, well, I looked up and I was expecting to see a shaved face, but I saw you instead. And she laughs a bit. Or something like that, little comments like that. Here a young woman is describing an experience that happened to her just that morning. And the message she received from an older male student, the training officer, was that her appearance did not match his expectations. Based on her shoes, her uniform shoes, he was expecting to see a man. Clearly, she didn't fit, and she didn't fit his expectations. These are just 3 examples of the three small examples of verbal messages of exclusion. Verbal communication to demonstrate or to say to somebody else, you don't belong. So what then at the organizational level? So at the organizational level, we could be talking about documents, mission statements for the organization, performance evaluations. Could be speeches. All of these can reflect the culture's organization, the organizational culture and values. The choice of words can be the difference between welcome and toxicity. In the context of gender, for instance, there has been a tendency to use masculine words and have them apply to all people. Talking about the race of men would be a classic example. All men value. Does that include women? Well, it might. We often use it to be all-inclusive, but not necessarily. That assumption that a masculine word, man, male, is inclusive has been shown not to be the case. Intellectually, we might know that that's what it means, but we don't actually process it that way. Perez, in her book, Invisible Women, asserts numerous studies over the past 40 years have consistently found that what is called the generic masculine, using words like he in a gender-neutral way, is not, in fact, read generically. It is read as overwhelmingly male. Similarly, Wade and Freed say studies show that words like he, his, and man, when used generically to refer to individuals or the human race, tend to conjure up images of men and not men and women together. So what does this take us to? It takes us to the idea that the masculine generic is not gender neutral. All right, so what's the obvious simple solution? Replace words like he or man, men, with he and she, they, humans, people. Problem solved, right? Unfortunately, it's not so easy because other words matter too. And other words are not necessarily gender neutral. Not too long ago, if you searched for words such as like power and weakness, you would get explicitly gendered terms. So when I did this like 3 years ago, I think, I did this search, when I looked for power, I would get words like male, mansful, man like manly and masculine. And for weakness, effeminate, effete, emasculate, and womanly. Well, so there's been some change, because when I was preparing this last night and I was looking for the words, and I went to thesaurus and to various other things, I didn't get these words. I got these instead. For power, brawn, forcefulness, might, muscle, and potency. For weakness, delicacy, agility, frailty, and impotence. Interestingly, when we look up words for masculine and feminine, there's a lot of overlap between the words that show up for power and weakness. So masculine, hardy, muscular, strong, vigorous, virile. Look mighty like those words on power, don't they? Even if we no longer have manly and masculine, we see pretty much the same words, at least some of them, for weakness and feminine. So what we've gotten rid of, for thesaurus.com and some of the other search engines, have gotten rid of some of that explicit connection to masculine and feminine. It's still there. I want to share with you now some research that colleagues and I have, well, we're still working on part of it. The part that I'm going to share with you, we finished a few years ago. And that's looking at some of these words, like the ones I just showed you, in a professional context. At the time when we conducted this research, we started conducting it back in 2015, students at the Naval Academy were organized into units, professional units called companies. They did a lot of things in these companies, professional type things. They lived in them, but they also did military evolutions and training and various things. So each semester, students had to evaluate their peers. They evaluated classmates in the same class, as well as all classmates below, those within their company, those with whom they should know well. And they were evaluating them on professional capacities, leadership in particular. We're a leadership laboratory, and we graduate leaders of character. So they had their peers, and what they had to do was they broke them into quintiles. So is this person in the top quintile, the second quintile, third, fourth, fifth? For those at the first quintile, they had to identify, this is number 1, 2, and 3. And they had to do the same thing at the very bottom. So let's just say there were 30 people that they were evaluating for that group. They had to evaluate 28, 29, and 30. And for those top 3 and bottom 3, they had to give an attribute assignment. These attributes were predefined, theoretically related to leadership, and there were a total of 79 of them. This is the list of the positive attributes. In reality, they were combined. So they didn't actually see them separated to positive and negative. So these are the positives that they saw. And here are the negatives. A lot of terms. We then looked at these terms and said, how are they applied? Who gets what? Theoretically, we would expect them to be equally distributed among students. That men would get the same set of terms and women would get the same set of terms. Nope. These are the terms that were received differently. So there were a total, remember, total of 79 terms. And then this is, I think, 28, ish. So of that 79, roughly 28, don't quote me on that, were statistically different. So on the left are the terms that men receive more than women. On the right are the terms that women receive more than men. Blue are positive, and that orangey goldish color, which someone suggested was supposed to represent the Naval Academy, since the Naval Academy is blue and gold. It reads a lot more orange to me, but blue and gold works. The goldish color are the negative terms. Tell me what you see. I know I'm supposed to be doing the talk, but I'm an educator. Tell me what you see. What stands out? No? All right. What I see, what my colleagues and I see, are a couple of things. One, there's a whole lot greater variety of the positive terms that men receive. Men receive a whole lot more different terms. Women receive a whole lot more variety of negative terms. By the way, there was no difference between men and women in the objective performance measures that we had. Objectively, men and women were equal performers. Go back to that quote by the Air Force Academy cadet. Equally capable, I would still pick the man. So, equally capable, and yet men get more positive terms. Women get more negative. By the way, the overall number of terms that each received, not the variety of terms. Individually, men and women each received roughly the same, statistically similar number of positive attributes. They received the same number, men received a lot greater variety. Women were much more likely to get compassionate. So, the other thing of particular note is that the terms are not simply different in the positive and negative. Oh, women receive statistically more negative comments, not just the greater variety, but statistically more. So not only was there a difference in positive and negative assignments, but these terms where we see gender difference are themselves gendered terms. There's been a fair amount of research that said, here, take a set of terms, take a set of words in which you characterize this word as masculine, feminine, neutral, neither, whatever. The words here tend to be highly gendered. Words like analytical, competent, which, by the way, is one of the highest praise that can be given to an academy student. Civilians tend to go, competency is the lowest acceptable bar, but high praise, they view it very highly. So, analytical, competent, highly masculine terms. Across pretty much any study that you look at that evaluates. Compassionate, energetic, inept, frivolous. Don't ask me why that word is on the leadership list. No idea. Passive. Goes back to kind of that word docile that showed up as a synonym for feminine. Gossip, excitable, temperamental, highly, highly gender-coded terms. So students have a list of 79 terms, and these are the ones where we see difference. Does it matter? Does it matter that these are the words that are being attributed? In a leadership context? In a professional context? I want my leaders to be compassionate. It makes for a much better place to work. So what's wrong with that? Well, there's two problems. One, flat out, if they're applied differentially, they're applied differently to different groups, that matters. Another way it matters is, who do you want to hire? If you're between two people and they are equal on every other attribute, every other characteristic that you're measuring, and you have only one job, who do you pick? Okay, it depends on the job, obviously. But let's say you're dealing with a technical job. Do you pick the person who is described as analytical, or do you pick the person who is described as compassionate? Equally capable, equal in every other measure. Similarly, if you have to let someone go, or you have only one spot where you can promote, who do you pick? Sorry, that was a flip there. The promote works the same way. You have to let someone go. Who are you going to pick? Are you going to pick the person who is described as arrogant, or the person who's described as inept? This seems to be, when I ask this question, it seems to be a personality sort of position here. Some people go, well, I'll pick the arrogant person because at least they're capable. Inept you can't fix. You can't do anything with that. In other cases, I get the exact opposite. I can't work with somebody who's arrogant. I don't want to work with someone who's arrogant. Inept, maybe they can be brought up. But when these words are applied differently to different groups, one, it impacts how we view that entire group. And second, it translates down the line into who gets hired, who gets promoted, who gets fired, who doesn't. These subtle words, often used without thinking about the underlying context, can have a real life impact. When I think it was last year, I showed this data to students, and they were seniors. And a few days later, one of them emailed me and went, "Oh my gosh, ma'am, I was just writing up a review for my plea, and I caught myself using this language. I corrected it, but I had no idea that I was doing it." Unintentional, not malicious, no malintent whatsoever, but highly gendered. And as I mentioned before, we could see the same thing if we looked at other categories. We could look at race, we could look at sexuality, race and ethnicity, because our words, I use the word connotation, Dr. Polchek used the word index, other meanings, other things, other ideas that we, by being part of a culture, have learned. And it takes conscious thought. It takes awareness to see them. It takes work to see them, and then to think about Where do we want to go? What do we want to do? So I want to wrap up with a few thoughts. The simplest, the obvious, words matter. Words can hurt. Words can uplift. Words can empower. So beyond words matter, context matters, how they're used, where they're used. We need to be aware situationally of what's going on. We need to be thoughtful with how we communicate. How do we communicate that people are welcome and valued? How do we ensure that we aren't inadvertently communicating a message that's contrary to our intent? So, 3 final thoughts. Well, actually, I guess it's 2 because I just shared one of them with you already. So, first of my final thoughts is that in the US, at least, we're seeing some change. While I grew up with the sticks and stones, and I certainly have many memories of playgrounds where that was said, my 12-year-old has never heard that before. There is a growing awareness of the power of words and that we need to be aware of them. That being said, access to internet, access to social media, has access to anonymous venues for communicating, has certainly made it really easy to say harmful things. And we certainly have seen, I don't know how it is here, but in the US there's been a lot of attention to cyberbullying. And that's about the words. So my final thought is, if we know that language can exclude and can harm, how do we actively work to ensure that the language